A few years ago, there was a curious story that drifted briefly through the public space and then disappeared again. No great scandal, no lasting damage, just a strange moment. People queued outside a warehouse in Glasgow for something that didn't exist, or perhaps existed only before they arrived. Inside, there was very little sparse props, confused organizers, a promise that had somehow arrived ahead of its own body. It became a joke, a meme, something to shake your head at, a neat little cultural punchline. Look what happens when images run faster than reality. But what interested me wasn't the failure, it was the thing. Because by the time anyone walked through those doors, something had already happened. A future had already been entered. A version of the self had already come online. Not in the building, but in the days before it, in the scrolling, in the imagining, in the little private rehearsal where someone tries on the feeling of a coming experience. And it made me wonder how often we think reality begins at the point of contact, when really it's already been rehearsed somewhere quieter. We live as if we meet the world cleanly, as if we arrive neutral and then react. But most of us arrive preloaded. We arrive as someone hopeful, someone guarded, someone expecting to be disappointed, someone expecting to be delighted. And the world, being what it is, tends to answer the person who arrived. So, yes, the warehouse is funny, but it's also revealing. It shows how quickly we step into an identity without calling it that, and how quickly we suffer when that identity collapses.
Yeah, that's the part that lingers for me too. The experience didn't begin in the warehouse. It began in the pause before buying the ticket. In the image that caught the eye, in the moment the body leaned forward slightly and thought, this could be fun. That leaning is subtle, almost invisible. Most people don't narrate it, they just feel it. A small lift in the chest, a softening, a sense of permission. Maybe life can be a little playful again. And it's real. People don't just attend events, they attend as someone expecting delight, someone willing to be charmed, someone temporarily lighter than usual, someone who has already stepped into a future self, even if only for an afternoon. When the outer world doesn't match that inner rehearsal, the discomfort isn't about the event at all. It's about the loss of a state that had already started to feel like home. And this is why disappointment can feel oddly personal, even when it shouldn't. It's not the props and it's not the price of the ticket. It's a sudden return to an older self, the one who knows better, the one who doesn't lean forward anymore. And if we're honest, most of us have been that person, not just with events, with relationships, with plans, with futures we touched internally before they ever had a chance to become real.
We often talk about imagination as if it's pretend, as if it's a decorative layer on top of reality, something we can indulge in or dismiss depending on our mood. And if you're the practical sort, you're told to keep it in its place. Daydreaming is fine, but don't build your life on it. But the body doesn't experience imagination that way. The nervous system responds to meaning, not proof. It responds to implication, to suggestion, to where this seems to be going. It can't always tell the difference between what is happening and what is being anticipated. That isn't spiritual, it's ordinary human wiring. You can watch it in real time. A thought arrives and the shoulders tighten. A possibility appears and the face opens, which is why people can feel anxious about things that never happen, or nostalgic for places that no longer exist, or excited about a future that remains theoretical. We are built to live slightly ahead of the present. We constantly sample the near future and adjust our state. So the collapse of that warehouse experience wasn't a failure of imagination, it was a demonstration of its effectiveness. Imagination moved first, structure didn't follow. And the moment structure didn't follow, something else became visible. The difference between the story you can inhabit and a story you can only visit.
And what's interesting is how quickly we blame imagination when things don't work. We say, I shouldn't have gotten my hopes up, as though hope were the error. But hope didn't fail here. It did exactly what it always does. It moved identity forward in time. It created a temporary self, the self who was about to have a lovely day, the self who is giving their child a memory, the self who still expects magic to show up occasionally, even in a tired world. That identity arrived early. So the pain wasn't disappointment, it was identity whiplash. And this is where the story becomes useful beyond the memes, because it shows a mechanism most people live inside without ever naming it. We don't just want outcomes. We want to be a certain kind of person in a certain kind of world. Outcomes are only the costume. What hurts is the sudden loss of that person. It's curious, isn't it, how often we treat reality as the cause of our feelings when the feelings were already present before reality had a chance to weigh in.
And this is where usual conversation about manifestation starts to feel a little thin because the problem wasn't belief. And it certainly wasn't insufficient effort. The problem was that a story outran its structure. We're often told reality works like this: idea, effort, reward. But lived experience tends to follow a different sequence. It goes story, state, behavior, and then sometimes structure. When structure can't support the story, things snap, not morally, mechanically, like trying to stand on a chair that isn't there. Falling doesn't mean you're bad at standing, it means the structure wasn't present. And the snap is felt first in the body. That's the part I keep coming back to. Before we theorize, the body knows. Before we explain, the system registers. This is safe. This is unsafe. This is coherent. This is incoherent. I can live here. I can't live here. If conscious reality creation has any grounded meaning at all, it might be this: paying attention to what you are being before you demand that reality prove anything.
Yes, and this is where people of all levels can recognize themselves in the story, not just in grand dreams, but in ordinary ones. The career that looked right on paper but felt wrong once lived inside. The relationship future that made sense socially but tightened the chest. The version of success that sounded impressive but felt exhausting to maintain. We don't suffer because we imagined. We suffer because we stepped into a self we couldn't stay inside. And the body always knows before the mind catches up. This is why some people have everything and still feel a strange emptiness. The structure is there, the boxes are all ticked, but the self inhabiting it is cramped. And other people have very little materially and still feel oddly spacious. Not because they're superior in any way, but because their inner story and their lived structure are in alignment. So the question becomes less about getting more and more about coherence. What kind of self are you building inside yourself, day by day, in small rehearsals you hardly notice?
There's something quietly unsettling here because it suggests that reality isn't responding to desire so much as identity. People didn't feel foolish after the warehouse failed. They felt foolish because they had already felt hopeful. Hope came first, The hopeful self came first. Reality simply didn't meet them there. And that sequence matters more than we're usually willing to admit. It suggests that many of our external problems are actually problems of relationship, not relationship with other people necessarily, but relationship with our own inner stance. The way we carry ourselves into the world, the self we assume is walking into the room. We like to think that we're describing the world accurately. Life is hard. People disappoint. Nothing ever changes. But those might be identities speaking, not facts. Not lies either. Just a self whose job is to keep expectations low so disappointment hurts less, which is understandable, but it's also a kind of living death, a slow refusal to lean forward. And what the Glasgow warehouse reveals is how quickly we can lean forward and how quickly we punish ourselves when we do.
It also explains why disappointment can linger even when nothing bad really happened, because something did happen. A self appeared and then vanished. That's a small loss, but it's a real one. The loss of tenderness, the loss of openness, the loss of that little internal posture that says maybe. And if this happens often enough, stepping into futures that collapse, people don't stop because they're wise, they stop because they're guarded. They confuse discernment with withdrawal, which is understandable, but not inevitable. Discernment, at its best, isn't cynicism, it's intimacy with your own system. It's knowing the difference between a story that expands you and a story that recruits you, between inspiration and performance, between a future you can walk into and a future that needs you to be present. And the humour in the warehouse story is that it's exaggerated enough to make the pattern obvious. Most of our lives are subtler, but the mechanism is the same.
This is where I think the story offers something gentler than advice. It suggests a different inquiry altogether. Not how do I get what I want, but what kind of future can I actually inhabit? That question doesn't sparkle, it doesn't trend, and it won't sell a course. It's too quiet. But it does something else. It steadies the system because it redirects attention away from spectacle and towards sustainability, away from the adrenaline of possibility and toward the calm of something that could become normal. And that matters because the nervous system cannot build a life on fireworks. It can only build a life on coherence. A future you can inhabit has a certain texture to it. It doesn't require you to deny your feelings. It doesn't require you to keep up a mood. It doesn't demand that you become someone else overnight. It feels strangely ordinary, like you could live it on a Tuesday. That might be the most radical thing that we can say in a culture addicted to intensity. The future that works is often the one that feels boringly plausible on the body.
And it changes how imagination is used. Instead of inflating, it settles. Instead of reaching for spectacle, it looks for coherence. Some futures excite the mind and exhaust the body. Others calm the body and quietly reorganize life. The warehouse story shows us what happens when imagination floats ahead of embodiment, but it also reveals how ready people are to step into joy when invited. That readiness isn't naive, it's capacity. And the real question is what we do with that capacity. Do we use it to whip ourselves into fantasies we can't sustain? Or do we use it to cultivate a state that reality can actually meet? This is where conscious creation becomes less about getting and more about becoming. not becoming in the heroic sense, but becoming in the gentle sense, allowing a new self to be rehearsed repeatedly until it's no longer a performance. It's curious how much changes when your inner story stops being a dramatic announcement and becomes a quiet assumption.
Which brings us back to that strange little moment in Glasgow. The event failed, the story faded, life moved on. But the mechanics were exposed. Identity moved first, reality responded, or didn't, accordingly. And perhaps that's the deeper freedom here. Not mastering reality, not forcing outcomes, not trying to prove anything to yourself, but learning to notice which selves feel sustainable, which stories you can live from on an ordinary Tuesday, not just visit for an afternoon. And there's another layer that feels worth naming. This wasn't a private imagination, it was collective. Thousands of strangers briefly rehearsed the same future. A picture became a cue, a promise became a plan, a suggestion became a small temporary world. We call it hype when we don't like it, we call it culture when we do. Either way, it shows that reality is relational, it's negotiated, it's co created through attention and agreement. So perhaps the invitation is not to stop imagining, but to choose more carefully what you lend your imagination to, because your attention is creative, whether you call it that or not. There's a practical tenderness in that, even for people who dislike spiritual language. You can test it without believing in anything. Notice how a room changes when you enter expecting conflict, and how it changes when you enter expecting simple contact. Same room, different you. Doesn't make you omnipotent, it just makes you influential in ways you previously outsourced to look. And once you see that, you can stop begging circumstances to change first.
So maybe we don't need conclusions, just a few quiet questions left open. What futures feel calm rather than thrilling? What imagined lives let your body stay relaxed? Where do you notice yourself leaning forward and where do you tense? What are you consenting to rehearse every day without noticing? Which stories are you borrowing from the world and which ones are actually yours? And what if reality isn't asking to be convinced at all? What if it's simply responding patiently to who you're already being? Not as a punishment and not as a reward either, just as a reflection. And if that's true, then perhaps the kindest move isn't to demand a great result, but to become more honest about the self you are inhabiting right now. Not to judge it in any way, just to notice. Because the moment you notice it, you're no longer fully inside it. And if you're listening and thinking, fine, but how do I do that? Notice the question itself. It assumes you're missing a technique. But what if you're not? What if the smallest shift is simply choosing a story that doesn't abandon your body? A story that lets you breathe, a story you can repeat without strain. You don't have to be certain, you just have to be sincere enough to rehearse a new self gently. Because the moment you notice it, you're no longer fully inside it. And that quietly is how change begins. It's not dramatic, it's not loud, it's a quieter way of living where the next moment feels more possible.
Before we close, a small practical pause. If this conversation stirred something, not excitement, but recognition, then you already know what to do. Liking, subscribing, sharing. Those are simply ways of saying this matters enough to keep exploring. No obligation, no persuasion, just an open door if you want to stay in the inquiry with us. These conversations only really come alive when they're shared quietly, thoughtfully, without fanfare. So if it feels right, tap the button, pass it on, let it travel. Until next time, think differently, dream boldly, and create consciously.